The sun over Tunisia burned like the eye of judgment. The sand shimmered white and cruel, swallowing every sound. But the grind of metal and the thunder of dying machines. For the men of the Africa Corps, this was not the empire they had been promised. It was a graveyard. By the spring of 1943, the legend of the Desert Fox had withered beneath. American firepower, German supply lines were shattered, tanks, stranded soldiers starving. Among them one young infantryman, Heinz Schaefer, 24 born. In Hanover, stared across the dunes at the black smoke rising from the end of the war. Heinz had believed everything he had been told, that the fatherland stood for order, culture, and destiny, that America was chaos, a nation of mongrels, greedy and soft. He had memorized those words in the barracks where propaganda posters showed American soldiers as monsters and their women as prey. He believed it. He had to, because in war, faith and lies can be the only thing keeping a man alive. On May 12, 1943, the last German positions in North Africa collapsed. More than 2,500 Axis troops laid down their arms. Heinz's unit, cornered and out of ammunition, raised a white cloth on a rifle, and that's when the moment came. A group of American soldiers approached, dusty, exhausted, their helmets streaked with sweat. Heinz expected to be shot. He expected vengeance. Instead, one of them, a sergeant from Kansas, barely older than him, tossed him a canteen. "Drink," the man said simply. Heinz stared, unable to move. The water was warm, tasted of metal and mercy. And for the first time in his young life, he realized something his government had never taught him, that an enemy could be human. The captured soldiers were herded into convoys, then to ports. Heinz was one of thousands packed aboard a Liberty ship bound across the Atlantic. They called it the long road to nowhere, but destiny had other plans. Days turned to weeks. The Atlantic air stung with salt and diesel. Men whispered that they were being taken to Alcatraz or to forced labor in the coal mines. But at night, under the starlight on the upper deck, Heinz looked west and thought of that American sergeant, the one who gave him water. He wondered what kind of country raised a man like that. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, a gray mirror swallowing the horizon. The ship creaked beneath its cargo. Thousands of men who had once called themselves conquerors, now they were prisoners. The deck stank of sweat, rust, and salt. Sleep came in fragments, hunger in waves. Heinz Schaefer stood among them, hands gripping the cold railing, eyes fixed on the water. Each sunrise blurred into the next. The days had no meaning. He didn't know where they were going, only that the journey west felt like falling off the edge of the world. Rumors whispered through the hold. Some said they were bound for Alaska to dig roads through ice. Others swore they'd be dropped on an island and left to rot. Heinz didn't believe any of it. He'd seen the faces of the American guards. They weren't cruel, just distant, efficient, human. He found himself wondering what America really looked like. The leaflets had shown cities, burning streets filled with gangsters and chaos, but the men who stood guard above them didn't look like gangsters. They looked like farm boys, men who smiled without reason, men who didn't seem to hate. When the first gulls appeared, the prisoners rushed to the deck, land faint and green against the gray mist. America. The sight of it silenced them all. Heinz expected barbed wire soldiers with rifles, maybe dogs. Instead, when they disembarked, the American officers simply counted them, stamped their papers, and handed them tin cups of coffee. It wasn't the America of the Nazi pamphlets. It was quiet, organized, and strangely kind. Prisoners were loaded onto trains, long rumbling columns that cut through fields and towns. Heinz sat by the window, watching a world that looked untouched by war, houses with white fences, children playing by the tracks, women hanging laundry under a blue sky. In every village they passed, people stopped to stare. Some waved. Others just looked curious, cautious, but not hateful. To Heinz, it was disarming. He had been told Americans despised them. Yet here he was rolling through their homeland as a prisoner, and no one spat at the train. Hours turned to days. The train pushed deeper south, where the air grew hotter, heavier. Texas, a name he had barely heard before. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the soldiers shouted the destination, Camp Hearn. The men stepped out into sunlight that felt like fire. Heat rippled off the ground. The sky was enormous, a dome of blinding white Heinz squinted at the camp gate's rows of low wooden barracks surrounded by fences, but what struck him wasn't the wire or the watchtowers. It was the trees, the open space, and the smell of earth. It wasn't a prison, it looked like a farm. The guards didn't bark orders, they spoke calmly. Even politely, line up, you'll be processed. You'll get showers and food showers food. Words that after months of war and surrender sounded like miracles inside. The barracks, Heinz found a bunk, a mattress stuffed with straw, and a small locker for his belongings. On the wall hung a simple notice, respect earns respect. He read it 3 times, not sure if it was a warning or a promise. That night, as darkness fell over the camp, the cicadas began their endless chorus outside. Heinz lay awake, listening. He thought of his mother's garden back in Hanover, the smell of rain on cobblestone, the sound of her voice calling him home for supper. For the first time in years, he wasn't hearing bombs. He whispered to himself, "So this is America." The next morning brought breakfast, real coffee, eggs, bread, butter. The prisoners stared at the trays as if it were a trick. Some refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. But Heinz was too hungry for pride. The coffee was bitter and perfect. The camp commander, a middle-aged major with kind eyes, addressed the men through an interpreter. He explained the rules. No fighting, no escape attempts. Work would be voluntary and paid. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The interpreter repeated it in German. The camp fell silent. The major looked across the crowd and said one last thing. "War ends, but how you act now, that's what people remember." Heinz never forgot that line. Over the weeks, he began to notice things that didn't fit the world he had imagined. The guards didn't mock them. They treated them as men. The food never ran out. The American Red Cross delivered mail. There were even English classes and art workshops. He walked along the fence and stared at the far-off fields beyond them. He could see farmers plowing, smoke rising from small houses. Freedom looked so simple, so ordinary. Some of the prisoners began to believe the Americans were trying to turn them, break their loyalty to Germany. But Heinz didn't feel broken. He felt something else, something that frightened him more than captivity. Curiosity. Wanted to know why these people, his supposed enemies, were showing him dignity. Late one evening, he saw a guard standing by the gate, humming a tune. Heinz didn't recognize it, but it sounded peaceful. Without thinking, he asked in halting English what song. The guard smiled. "It's called Home on the Range." Home. The word hit Heinz harder than he expected. That night, he sat on his bunk staring at the ceiling and realized he could no longer see the Americans as monsters. They were just men, tired, ordinary, and somehow still kind. And that was more dangerous to his beliefs than any weapon. He had crossed the ocean expecting to find enemies. Instead, he found a Vandla mirror reflecting everything his country had lost. Camp Hearn became its own strange little world, a patch of Germany surrounded by Texas soil. Beyond the fence, the land stretched flat and endless, dotted with oak trees and cotton fields. Inside, life organized itself into something eerily normal. Every morning, the prisoners lined up for roll call. Every afternoon, they worked or read or wrote letters. At dusk, they watched the sun melt into the horizon like a fire sinking into dust. The barracks smelled of soap and sweat. Heinz's bunkmates came from every corner of the Reich, Berliners, Bavarians, even a few Austrians. Some had been engineers, others students, a few were still boys. War had swallowed them all, and now they shared the same routine: eat, work, wait. The Americans kept their promise. The food never ran out, the guards didn't hit them, and slowly the fear that had clung to them since capture began to fade. For Heinz, that was when a new kind of fear took its place. He began to notice small things: how easily the guards laughed, how they joked even with the prisoners, how they treated one another with a kind of equality that didn't exist back home. In Germany, order was power. In Texas, order seemed to be built on respect, and yet not everyone saw it that way. Among the prisoners were men who still believed the Reich would rise again. They whispered about betrayal, about loyalty to Hitler, about the shame of being captured. They painted swastikas on the walls, held secret meetings at night. They called themselves Die Schwarzen, The black ones, to them, Heinz's curiosity about America was treason. One afternoon, while he sat by the fence sketching the clouds, a shadow fell over him. 3 men stood there, older, harder. One leaned close and said quietly, "Careful, Schaefer, the war isn't over for everyone." Heinz said nothing, but he understood that night someone tore his sketchbook to pieces and scattered the pages across the floor. No one claimed responsibility. No one had to. Still, Heinz refused to stop observing. He'd begun keeping a secret diary, small, hidden between the slats of his bunk. Each night he wrote what he saw: the way the guards smiled, the sound of laughter drifting from the mess hall, the taste of coffee that didn't have to be earned through fear. In his entries he wrote words he'd never dared write before. Maybe everything we were told was wrong. The camp itself functioned like a small town. There was a barber, a tailor, even a choir. The Americans allowed it, even encouraged it, claiming it kept morale high. There was a theater too. Once a month, the prisoners put on plays. They built sets out of old crates, painted scenery on bedsheets. Heinz watched one of those performances, a comedy about a German baker and his clumsy apprentice. The laughter that filled the barracks sounded like something from another life. He realized how long it had been since he'd heard men laugh without bitterness. But laughter couldn't erase the shadows. Every week the guards discovered pamphlets slipped under doors. Crude Nazi propaganda urging prisoners to resist American corruption. Once a young man was found beaten in the showers for saying the war was lost. The guards investigated, but no one spoke inside. The fence's silence was its own form of survival. Heinz watched, learned, and withdrew. He began spending his days in the camp library, a small wooden room lined with books in English and German. There he discovered something dangerous: ideas. He read Mark Twain and Whitman. He found stories about freedom, rebellion, and the dignity of ordinary people, and he began to understand why the Americans fought the way they did, not for empire, but for the belief that men could choose their own path. One afternoon, while translating a passage from Leaves of Grass, he paused over a line: "I am large, I contain multitudes." He read it again and again until he understood America wasn't one thing. It wasn't the caricature he'd been shown. It was a contradiction, a nation of strength and compassion, of violence and generosity. And somehow it worked. That night he wrote in his diary, "Freedom is not given, it is lived." Weeks passed, the seasons turned. The cotton fields outside the wire turned brown, then green. Again Heinz's hair grew longer, his shoulders relaxed. The guards treated them more like workers than captives. Sometimes one of them would toss a baseball near the fence and shout for volunteers. The Germans didn't understand the rules, but they learned quickly, laughing, cheering, playing under the Texas sun. Heinz remembered one game in particular: a German prisoner catching a ball and throwing it so wildly that it rolled past the guard tower. Everyone froze, waiting for the alarm. Instead, the guard laughed, picked up the ball, and threw it back. For a moment, the war felt like a rumor, but inside Heinz still wrestled with guilt. His brother was fighting somewhere in Russia. His father's factory had been bombed. His mother's letters grew shorter, written in the trembling hand of exhaustion. Each word reminded him that while he lived safely behind American fences, his family lived beneath Allied bombs. It was an unbearable contradiction to be a prisoner, and yet safer than home. In February 1944, a new group of prisoners arrived, gaunt, hollow-eyed men from Italy, veterans of the retreat. They brought stories of devastation, of cities reduced to ash, of children starving in the ruins. One of them, a medic named Klaus, told Heinz quietly, "You're lucky, Schaefer, you were captured by the right side." That sentence stayed with him. By summer, the camp routine had become rhythm. Heinz volunteered for outdoor labor, eager to see more of this country that defied everything he believed. When the officer asked if he'd be willing to work on a local farm, Heinz didn't hesitate. He wanted to see what lay beyond the wire. He wanted to meet America face to face, and without knowing it, he was about to. The first time Heinz rode out of Camp Hearn in the back of a military truck, he felt both freedom and fear. For months, the world had been framed by barbed wire. Now it opened into miles of Texas. Farmland, flat gold, and endless. The horizon itself looked like a promise he did not yet trust. They drove for half an hour before stopping at a gate made of weathered wood. A farmhouse stood beyond it, its white paint peeling beneath the sun. A man was waiting by the porch, broad-shouldered, wearing a straw hat and the calm expression of someone who had long ago made peace with hard work. His name was Bill Carter. He was 48, a cotton farmer, and a father who had lost his only son in Italy. The army had told him the German prisoners would help harvest the fields. He'd said yes because he had no choice. The crops would not wait for grief to end. He looked at Heinz. He saw a boy not much older than his son had been. When Heinz looked at him, he saw a man who could have been his father if fate had been kinder. The guards gave simple instructions. The prisoners would work from sunrise to late afternoon. They would be paid in camp credits, enough to buy small things from the commissary. Then the truck drove away, leaving Heinz and 4 others standing under the enormous sky, surrounded by a silence so complete it felt sacred. Bill Carter handed each man a shovel. "Start with the rows on that side," he said, pointing. "Do not worry about speed, just do it right." The Germans nodded. None of them spoke English well enough to answer. They worked in quiet rhythm, turning soil that smelled of heat and life. Heinz's hands blistered quickly, but the pain felt clean. After years of destruction, creating something again, even a furrow in the earth felt like redemption. Carter watched from the porch. Every now and then, he offered water. When the men hesitated, unsure if it was a trick, he said gently, "Go on, you will need it." Heinz took a sip, meeting the farmer's eyes for a moment. There was no hatred there, only weariness. As days became weeks, an unspoken truce formed between them. Carter would point, gesture, teach. Heinz would learn fast, eager to prove he could work honestly. By the 3rd week, Carter began calling him Heinz, unable to pronounce the German Heinz. Heinz did not correct him. The sound of his name in that drawl made him feel strangely at ease sometimes. During breaks, Carter would sit on the tailgate of his truck, sip coffee, and talk to himself as much as to the prisoners. He spoke about the weather, the price of seed, the smell of rain before a storm. Heinz listened. He did not understand every word, but he understood the tone, the grounded patience of a man tied to his land. One afternoon, Carter pointed to the horizon where thunderheads were building. "Rain's coming," he said. Heinz followed his gaze. In Germany, rain meant shelter. Here it meant hope. The soil drank it in, dark and steaming. When the storm passed, Carter handed Heinz a dry towel and said, "You did good work today." It was the first praise Heinz had received from an American. He did not know how to answer. He simply nodded, feeling something inside him shift. Back in camp, he told his bunkmates about the farmer. Some scoffed, "You are being fooled. They said they want you to forget who you are." Heinz shook his head. "No," he said quietly, "they want me to remember I am human." Did not know if he believed his own words yet, but he wanted to. As summer deepened, the work became routine. The guards stopped escorting the men as closely. There was nowhere to run, and no one who wanted to. The Americans trusted them enough to leave their rifles slung over their shoulders. That trust, small as it was, became a kind of gift. Heinz began learning English through fragments. He repeated words Carter used. "Field bucket, good." Carter, amused, tried to teach him full sentences. One morning he pointed to a row of corn and said, "This here is home." Grown. Heinz echoed carefully, "Homegrown." Carter laughed, not unkindly. "That is right, you got it." There was a warmth in that laughter that no propaganda could explain. One evening, after a long day's work, Carter offered the men slices of watermelon. They sat on the edge of the field, juice running down their hands, the sun melting into red and gold behind them. Carter looked at Heinz and said softly, "My boy used to sit there." He did not say more, and Heinz did not ask. But something passed between them, an understanding that grief recognized grief, no matter which side of the wire it came from. Back in the barracks that night, Heinz wrote in his diary, "Today I ate with an American. He shared his food and his silence. I think we both needed it." By September, the harvest was done. The fields lay bare, the air cooling. Heinz's English had improved enough that he could exchange simple words. On the last day, when the truck came to collect them, Carter walked over, wiping his hands on a rag, held out something small, an old pocket knife with a cracked handle. "Here," he said, "you worked hard, keep it." Heinz hesitated, then took it. "Danke," he said. Carter nodded. "You are welcome, Heinz." On the ride back to camp, Heinz turned the knife in his palm. It was dull, ordinary, and priceless. He realized that in 3 months of working the stranger's land, he had learned more about honor and decency than in all his years under the swastika. He had expected chains, he had found trust. He had expected hate, he had found humanity. That night as he lay on his bunk, he thought of Carter's weathered face, the slow rhythm of his words, the quiet dignity of his labor. He realized that this man who had lost everything to Heinz's country had treated him better than his own officers ever had. In that realization, the walls inside Heinz began to crumble. He had crossed an ocean as a soldier. He would leave this place as something else entirely. Autumn crept quietly into Texas, softening the air, turning the sun from a hammer into a companion. For Heinz, the rhythms of camp life began to change. The long, punishing days in the fields had given way to quieter hours filled with reading, writing, and thinking. Too much thinking. He had arrived in America as a loyal soldier of the Reich, taught to believe that he was part of a chosen nation, that others existed to be ruled or erased. But each sunrise in Texas chipped away at that illusion. The guards treated him with fairness, the farmers with decency. The people in town, when he was taken there under escort, did not spit or sneer. Some even nodded politely as if he were simply another young man caught up in something larger than himself. It was disarming, it was confusing, it was freedom of the mind, and it terrified him. One evening after dinner in the mess hall, Heinz sat at a long wooden table with 3 other prisoners. Among them was Kurt Weber, an older man with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue who still clung fiercely to the doctrines of the Reich. Kurt spoke often of the coming victory, though everyone knew Germany was collapsing that night. Kurt looked at Heinz's English notebook and said, "Why do you bother with their language? You will go home soon enough, back to real civilization." Heinz looked at him and asked, "Civilization, the one that burns books and calls murder duty?" Kurt's face hardened. "You sound like them." "Maybe," Heinz said softly. "That is not such a bad thing." The table fell silent. Outside, a train whistle echoed through the dusk, reminding everyone that the war was still real, still out there swallowing lives. Later in his bunk, Heinz stared at the ceiling. He realized that what frightened Kurt was not defeat, it was awakening, because awakening meant admitting they had been wrong. The next morning, an American chaplain visited the camp. He was a kind-faced man named Reverend Miller, who came not to preach but to listen. He carried books, English classics, philosophy, even poetry, and offered them freely. Heinz chose one at random, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He read it slowly, sounding out words in the dim light of the barracks. The story of a boy and a runaway slave on a riverboat seemed at first far removed from his world, but the more he read, the more he understood what Twain was saying, that freedom was not about nations or flags. It was about conscience, about the courage to see another human being as equal, even when the world told you not to. He closed the book and sat quietly, feeling the weight of the words settle deep inside him. Weeks passed. The war moved closer to its end. Rumors spread through the camp like wind. Berlin bombed Hitler and hiding American troops pushing deep into Germany. Some prisoners cheered in secret, others sank into denial. Heinz spent his days in the library tent, helping the chaplain organize the small collection of donated books. He had become one of the few trusted prisoners allowed to move freely between sections without constant supervision. The guards called him the professor. One afternoon, as he sorted through a box of magazines, he came across a photograph that froze him in place. It showed a crowd of American families smiling in front of a newly opened schoolhouse, men and women of every color standing side by side. The caption read, "United for Victory." He stared at it for a long time. Back home, he had been told that such a society was weak and pure, doomed to collapse. But here it stood, real and thriving. A nation built not on purity, but on diversity. He thought of Bill Carter, the farmer who had given him the pocket knife. He thought of the guards who trusted him. He thought of the warmth of the people who should have hated him most. He realized that the strength of America was not in its weapons. It was in its contradictions, in the way it allowed differences to coexist without collapsing. That Night he wrote in his journal, "We were told America was chaos, but perhaps freedom always looks like chaos to those who fear it." As the months passed, Heinz began teaching English to other prisoners. Some came out of curiosity, others came to mock, but slowly even the skeptical ones began to listen. He used simple sentences drawn from his work on the WEM. Farm, the sun rises, the man works, the man eats, the man sleeps. Then he added new ones, the man forgives, the man learns. Each lesson became an act of quiet rebellion, not against America, but against ignorance. In December 1944, a letter arrived for Heinz. It had traveled across oceans and censors, its edges worn thin. It was from his mother in Hanover. Her words trembled on the page. "We have lost everything. Your father is gone. The city burns, but if you live, that is enough. Learn what you can be better than what we were made to be." He read the letter again, and again, the tears hot and uncontrollable. His mother's words broke what little remained of the iron cage in his heart. From that day, Heinz no longer thought of himself as a prisoner of America. He was a student of it, began to see the camp not as a cage, but as a classroom. And beyond its fences lay a nation that was teaching him the hardest lesson of all. That humanity was not defined by borders, language, or race, but by the choices one makes when given power over another. By the spring of 1945, the guards no longer called him the German. They called him Heinz, just Heinz, and when the news came that Hitler was dead and Germany had surrendered, Heinz did not cheer. He simply stood in silence, looking out at the Texas sky, whispering a quiet prayer that his homeland might one day learn what he had discovered behind barbed wire. He had been sent to America as a weapon, but America had disarmed him, not with bullets, but with kindness. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent, but the world that followed was quieter in a way that felt wrong, like a body still breathing after its soul had gone. In the summer of 1946, after more than 3 years in captivity, Heinz Schaefer was told he would be repatriated. The announcement came without ceremony, a roll call in the camp square, a list of names read aloud under the blazing sun. When he heard, a strange mixture of relief and dread rose inside him. He had spent nearly half his youth in a land that was supposed to be his enemy. Now he was being sent home to a place that might no longer exist. The night before departure, the prisoners gathered in the barracks to pack their few belongings. Heinz folded his diary, the pocket knife from Bill Carter, and a worn copy of Huckleberry Finn into a small satchel. He looked around the dimly lit room, men laughing nervously, some crying, some silent. They had arrived here as soldiers of a fallen empire. They were leaving as men without a flag. At dawn, American trucks carried them to the coast. The road wound past cotton fields, small towns, and rail crossings. Heinz watched from the window, his heart heavy with gratitude and sorrow. He wanted to remember it all: the golden fields, the scent of rain, the slow drawl of the people who had changed him. As they boarded the transport ship, an officer handed each man a final ration pack. When it was Heinz's turn, the officer paused and said quietly, "Good luck, kid. You were one of the good." When Heinz nodded, he wanted to say thank you, but the words caught in his throat. The ship left port, cutting across the Atlantic. Heinz stood on the deck watching the receding American coast until it vanished into mist. Behind him lay everything he had come to understand. Ahead lay everything he had to face. Days later, Europe appeared on the horizon, gray, scarred, and silent. When they reached Germany, the men disembarked at Bremerhaven. The docks were ruins, cranes hung broken, and the air smelled of ash and rust. The city looked like a memory half erased by fire. Heinz's boots sank into the mud as he walked inland. He passed hollow buildings, piles of brick where homes had stood. Children scavenged for food. Women traded cigarettes for bread. Old men sat on curbs staring at nothing. This was not the Germany he had been told he was fighting for. This was the Germany his obedience had helped destroy. He reached Hanover after 3 days of travel. The train stations were ghosts, their roofs gone, their platforms cracked by bombs. He walked the last mile on foot. The neighborhood where he had grown up was unrecognizable: charred walls, empty windows, the smell of damp smoke that never left. When he reached the spot where his parents' house had stood, he stopped. Only the foundation remained half buried in rubble. He sank to his knees, clutching the satchel to his chest, opened his mother's letter again, the one she had sent from the ruins months earlier. Learn what you can be better than what we were made to be. He whispered the words aloud. Then he closed his eyes and let the wind carry them away. For days he searched for her. He walked through refugee centers, Red Cross offices, and makeshift shelters. At last he found her in a schoolhouse converted into housing for displaced families. Her hair was gray, her hands thin, but when she saw him, her eyes filled with light. Heinz, she said barely above a whisper. He dropped his bag and embraced her. In that moment, the years of war, distance, and shame dissolved. For the first time since his capture, he felt like a son again. They talked for hours in the flickering light of a single candle. She asked about the camp, about America. He told her everything, not the battles, not the surrender, but the kindness, the farmer, the chaplain, the books. When he finished, she smiled faintly and said, "Then perhaps you were captured for a reason." In the weeks that followed, Heinz helped clear rubble from the streets. The Allies had begun programs to rebuild German towns and to re-educate citizens. Many ex-soldiers resisted clinging to old lies, but Heinz did not. He volunteered to work with local officials, translating American pamphlets about democracy, freedom, and rights. He read them slowly, carefully, like a man studying the shape of a new world. The words felt both foreign and familiar, echoes of what he had seen in Texas. Now returning to him in his own language. One day, he found himself speaking to a small crowd in the town square. They were tired, angry, uncertain. He told them about the America he had seen, not the one from propaganda, but the real one. "They beat us," he said, "but they did not hate us. They could have treated us as animals, but they did not. They taught me that freedom is not about power, it is about dignity. And that is what we must learn again if we are ever to live as humans." People listened, some turned away, but others, especially the young ones, nodded quietly. In the years that followed, Heinz became a teacher. He taught English in a small rebuilt schoolhouse, using the same copy of Huckleberry Finn that had once kept him company in captivity. He would tell his students, language is a bridge. Every word you learn is a step toward understanding someone you once feared. Sometimes on warm evenings, he would take out the pocket knife from Bill Carter and hold it in his palm. The wood handle was worn smooth, the blade dull from age. He never used it. He did not need to. It was not a tool anymore. It was a reminder that an enemy had shown him mercy, that a stranger had treated him like a man when his own leaders had not, that humanity could survive even in the darkest places if someone dared to offer it. Years later, when he was asked about the war by his students, Heinz would say quietly, "I went to fight for Germany. I came back fighting for humanity." And when they asked him how he had changed, he would smile and answer, "America captured my body, but it freed my soul." Time moved on. The war became a shadow, fading, but never gone. Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes, brick by brick, street by street. The hunger eased, the cities hummed again, and the world that had once been carved by barbed wire began to heal. By 1955, Heinz Schaefer was 40 years old. His hair had started to gray at the temples, and the hard edges of his youth had softened into quiet strength. He taught English at a modest school in Hanover, his classroom filled with the laughter of children who would never know what it meant to fight for a lie. He rarely spoke of his years in America, not because he wanted to forget, but because it felt sacred, something too fragile to be turned into a story. But every year on a warm spring morning, he would walk to the small post office near the market square, take out a single envelope, and send a letter to Bill Carter, the farmer from Texas. In those letters, he wrote of life, of rebuilding, of gratitude. He told Bill that the pocket knife still rested on his desk, that he had married a nurse who had survived the bombings, that his mother had passed peacefully, proud, that her son had become a teacher. He wrote, "I often wonder if your fields still bloom. The way I remember, I can still see the sunset on the rows of cotton, and I still hear your voice teaching me that work done with dignity is the only kind that matters." For years, the letters went unanswered. Bill Carter was an old man by then, his eyesight failing, his farm smaller than it once was but one day in the winter of 1956, an envelope arrived in Hanover with American stamps and shaky handwriting. It read simply, "Heinz, you were the only German I ever called friend. My son died in the war, but meeting you made me understand something I never could before, that the enemy is just another father's boy. I am glad you found peace. You earned it. Keep that knife. It belonged to my son once. I gave it to you so that something of him would live in kindness instead of bitterness. Your friend." Bill Heinz sat at his desk for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. He read it again and again, the words sinking deep into the quiet corners of his soul. He walked outside into the fading winter light. Snow dusted the rooftops of the rebuilt city, and for a moment he could almost smell the Texas fields, the warmth, the dust, the scent of rain before a stormy. Took the pocket knife from his coat, ran his thumb along the worn handle, and whispered, "Danke, Bill." That night, he placed the knife and the letter side by side in a small wooden box. On its lid he carved a single word, "Freedom." Years passed. Heinz grew old, his students grew up, and the world changed again. But the story of the German prisoner who had found his humanity in a Texas camp lived quietly through those he had taught. They would tell it to their children, not as a tale of war, but as proof that even in the darkest times, the human heart can still choose compassion over cruelty. When Heinz died in 1984, the people of his town placed the wooden box on his coffin. Inside it lay 2 lives of German soldiers and an American farmers bound forever by a single act of mercy. The newspaper that reported his death wrote one simple line beneath his photo: "He crossed an ocean as a prisoner and found his freedom and forgiveness." And in that single sentence the whole story lived again. The war ended long ago. The camps are gone, the battlefield silent. But somewhere in a dusty Texas field and in the rebuilt streets of Hanover, the legacy of one German prisoner remains, a reminder that even enemies can teach each other how to be free, because sometimes the greatest victory is not won on the battlefield, it is won in the heart.